Once upon a time, there was a generous man who lived in a small village in the Chinese countryside. His name was Mr. Li. Mr. Li loved to host people, and his house was always full of people that came from many places. There was always a bowl of soup and fresh bread served to everybody. Although Mr. Li did not smile often, he welcomed visits at any time on any day. Mr. Li and his wife, Miss Li, had 2 sons. His youngest son no longer lived with them, and that made his wife sad, even though Mr. Li tried his very best to make her happy. In their home, Mr. and Miss Li lived with their eldest son, Hua, and a girl that they had adopted. Her name was Xiu. It was Mr. Li's idea to adopt Xiu, as he wanted to give a home to someone who didn't have one. One day, Mr. Li took the usual path to his work in the fields, and he was surprised when he saw a little girl crying at the roadside. Looking closer, Mr. Li noticed that she was not an ordinary girl. She was a girl made out of stone. He approached her and tried to ask who she was and why she was there all alone, but the girl just cried and sobbed. So Mr. Li decided to bring her home, at least until he could find out more about her. Mr. Li took the girl into his arms very gently, as he realized that some of the stones were a bit loose. When he entered into his home carrying the girl, his wife was not happy. She didn't think that any child could make up for her young lost son. And now, Mr. Li had brought yet another child into the house, even without the support of his wife. Looking at the little girl made out of stone, his wife asked, "Don't we have enough mouths to feed?" And Mr. Li answered, "It is just until I find out who she is and which family she belongs to. I promise." Days passed, and one night, when the children were sleeping, Mr. Li said to his wife, "Shin, I know you might not be happy about this, but I can find no one related to this poor little girl. Perhaps somebody just made her out of boredom and then decided that there was no need for taking care of a girl made out of stone. We can't just let her go. If we don't adopt her, nobody will take care of her." While talking, the face of his wife became more and more stiff. However, she was raised to obey her husband, so she said finally, "It is your money. As long as my son does not lack food and education, you can do whatever you want with this other girl." He decided to name the girl Yatu, and little by little, the girl made out of stone started to talk and become happy, but not completely. Mr. Li's wife had affections only for her son, and although she was not really mean to the girls, she always served her son first and applauded everything he did. So it became very clear that Hua was her favorite, mainly because he was her birth child. On the other hand, Mr. Li was quite good with the girls, at least by providing everything they needed to survive. Nonetheless, he was not very affectionate. Yatu and Xiu were grateful for having a house and good food, but they did not feel love. Yatu knew that Miss Li did not love her or Xiu as real daughters, but there was doubt about Mr. Li. He had taken them home, so surely he felt something for them. But why did he not show his feelings through a hug or a kiss? Would it just be generosity without love? That was the main reason why the little girl made out of stone did not feel completely happy. Yatu did not want to seem ungrateful, but there were times when she felt empty. When it was time for Yatu to start school, she felt excited about all the things she could learn. "I could even learn how to make music," she thought. But when she started school, the children of the village, with their innocent cruelty, started to make fun of her, as they also did to her older sister, Xiu, for being lost children who were taken by Mr. Li's family. Because Yatu was made out of stone, the mockery did not seem to affect her too much. She had a natural ability to be strong and to protect herself. The situation with her sister Shiu was different though. She was sensitive, and the insults of the villagers affected her heart and hurt her very much. Sometimes she felt as if she would prefer not to exist than to live like that. As a good father, Mr. Li worried about the girls and tried to protect them from the nasty comments of the villagers. Sometimes he even limited what they were allowed to do or places that they were allowed to go. There were few things that Mr. Li was most concerned, and he expected the girls to understand. To Yatu, Mr. Li told her to be careful with the fruits of the mulberry tree because they could cause her stones to fall apart. To Shiu, Mr. Li told her not to go to the river because the water could destroy her body. Shiu was also not an ordinary girl. Under her skin, she was made of mud. The poor Shiu was tired of villagers' mistreatment and felt that she could no longer live being ignored without a single tender sign towards her. So one day she decided to do what was prohibited. The water of the river was too strong for her skin and finally got into what Shiu was made of. When Mr. Li realized that Shiu went to the river, it was too late. He found just a little puddle of mud that vaguely resembled Shiu. "My beautiful daughter, what have you done?" he cried with his eyes full of tears. At that moment, Shiu understood she was loved. She said, "Thank you," and her smile vanished in the water. A little ceremony was made for Shiu. Mr. Li composed himself in front of everybody. It was a sad ceremony in which nobody cried. Yatu started asking herself, what would happen if I died? Would anybody miss me or cry for me? Those ideas were tormenting Yatu the whole day. After sunset, it was a beautiful summer night, and because Yatu could not sleep, she decided to walk to the barn. She thought, since I can't sleep, at least I can lie down on the straw and look at the stars. While approaching the place, she heard something strange, like somebody sobbing. Was it a ghost? The closer she got, higher were the cries. One could imagine a person full of terrible sadness and suffering deeply. Behind some tall stacks of hay, she discovered Mr. Li, on his knees, crying. Yatu approached Mr. Li softly and put her little hand on his shoulder. His pain was so big that he was not surprised by the touch. He raised his head and saw the questioning eyes of the little girl. "Promise me you will never do something like that. Please promise me you will never harm yourself." She nodded in agreement. Mr. Li calmed down a little bit, and standing up, he took the hand of the little girl made out of stone and took her back home. That night, she understood that there were other ways to show love without words. Obviously, Mr. Li loved her sister so much that his pain was unbearable. But did he love her too? Still, she had doubt inside her heart. Life went on as usual. Yatu went to school, her father worked a lot to support the family, and Miss Li continued ignoring her, and her brother Hua got most of the attention. At least she knew she could study. She had a home, a warm bed, and enough to eat. But if she could just know that somebody loved her. One day, things became tougher because some of the children started making fun of Yatu for being made of stone. They said, "You must come from a rock. You are cold. Nobody wants to hug you because it's painful." They pointed at the little girl made out of stones and laughed. Yatu felt that sometimes words could be harder than what she was made of. Returning from school, Yatu decided to take a different path. She discovered a beautiful mulberry tree. Somehow, Yatu remembered that Mr. Li warned her about eating those berries, and something about melting stones. Mr. Lee was in fact always insisting that Yatu must not eat too much of what her body could take, so it was best to avoid mulberries. But as all little girls, even those made out of stone, she thought her father was exaggerating and that nothing bad could happen if she just understood how much of the berry she could eat. As Yatu took the first taste of the berry into her mouth, she found out how irresistible the delicious fruit was and wanted more and more. Before she was able to feel satisfied, the little girl made out of stone started feeling weird and dizzy. She could no longer feel her body and ended up falling from the mulberry tree. On the ground, Yatu found it difficult to walk, as if her legs did not want to obey her. She saw that one of the stones started to fall down from her hand. The little girl made of stone understood then what would happen if she ate too much of the forbidden berry. At that time, Mr. Lee was just coming home from work when he saw Yatu lying on the ground by the tree. He dropped his tools and ran towards her. Mr. Lee immediately noticed that the stones were melting off her body. He knew that he had no time. He took Yatu into his arms, and on the way home he yelled to his wife to open the door. Miss Lee got scared when she saw what was happening to Yatu. Mr. Lee told his wife to grab a blanket fast. He took the blanket and carefully wrapped the fragile body of melting pebbles of Yatu. The family did not have a horse or a carriage, and the nearest healer was miles away in the city. If Mr. Lee wanted to save the life of the little girl, he knew he had to run fast as he could. He then put Yatu in a basket and started to run without further explanation. Yatu felt her head spinning, and she had difficulty in keeping her eyes open. While being carried on Mr. Lee's back, the little girl made of stone saw the effort Mr. Lee put into saving her life. She saw Mr. Lee crying in silence while running. In that moment, Yatu saw something extraordinary in Mr. Lee. He too was made of stone. He just had learned how to cover his stone with soft skin to blend better in the world he lived in. His heart was still a rock, and that was his inner strength. But his soul was tender and loving. She understood now that Mr. Lee needed to be strong so that he could provide and protect his family. Yatu felt the love of this man who had done everything in his power to save her. The little girl made of stone finally felt his tenderness and understood how his caring nature was present in all the moments they had spent together. He had cared for her from the instant he had laid eyes on her, and he had done everything he could to protect her and make her part of his family. Sometimes acts are stronger than words, and his acts were his way to say, "I love you." Finally, the little girl made of stone knew that her father and her shared the same essence. He was her rock, and he would never fail her. Yatu fell asleep peacefully and woke up 2 days later with Mr. Lee beside her bed. The first thing she saw was the smile on his face. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I really didn't know." "It's okay," he answered. "Don't make any effort, just rest." Yatu fell asleep again, and when she woke up, she noticed that something had changed. The little girl made of stone had finally learned how to cover her body with skin, and from that moment on, she didn't need to hide under her thickness. She felt really happy, and her heart was full of joy, not because she looked like the other girls, but because of the transformation that happened inside her. She too will have a heart of rock, a heart strong enough to live in the world without being harmed, and a tender soul to understand, to care for others, and to share love as her father did. Yatu felt how strongly connected she was to her father. She knew they had a strong bond, and their love would transcend beyond the world they lived in. At that moment, the little girl made of stone knew that she could pursue anything that her heart desired. She could live a life with adventures, and one day she would grow up to be a strong woman and a loving mother.